I always believed that family was built on trust, especially when it came to my little brother James. We weren't just siblings, we were supposed to have each other's backs. So when our parents got older and I dedicated my life to caring for them, I never once questioned that James would do the right thing when the time came. He was the successful one, the lawyer in New York. I was just the daughter who stayed behind. But nothing prepares you for the moment you realize the person you trusted most has stolen everything you've ever known. I sat there listening to the lawyer read my mother's will. $50,000. That's all I was worth after 63 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and love. Meanwhile, James walked away with millions. The house, the investments, the art. I felt betrayed, abandoned. At an age where starting over wasn't just hard, it felt impossible. But life has a way of revealing truths when you least expect it. And for me, it came in the form of a hidden letter from my father. What would you do if your own brother erased your future? Stay with me, because this is the story of how I took back everything, without lifting a finger. Growing up in Seattle, I never imagined my life would turn out this way. I was the eldest Katherine Mitchell, the dependable daughter. From an early age, it was clear that responsibility would always fall on my shoulders. James, my younger brother, was the golden child, charming, ambitious, and always the center of attention. Our parents adored him, and I did too. I wasn't jealous. He had dreams bigger than this city, and I was proud when he left for law school on the East Coast. While James built his career in New York, I stayed behind. Not because I lacked ambition, but because someone had to be here for Mom and Dad as they aged. At first, it was simple checking in, helping with errands. But as the years passed, those small tasks became full-time care. When Dad started forgetting things, dates, names, where he put his keys, we brushed it off as normal aging. But deep down, I knew I saw the fear in his eyes when he realized he didn't recognize his own handwriting. The diagnosis came swiftly: Alzheimer's. Our world shifted overnight. I gave up what little personal life I had left. No more weekend getaways, no dating, no hobbies. Every day revolved around doctor appointments, medications, and making sure Dad felt safe in a world that was slipping away from him. James. He called occasionally, always too busy with court cases or clients to visit. But he'd reassure me, "Katie, you're doing amazing. I'll handle everything when the time comes." And I believed him. He was family, a lawyer. Of course, he'd protect what was rightfully ours. Mom grew more dependent on James over the phone. She trusted his advice on financial matters, and I didn't interfere. Why would I? He was the expert, and I was just the caregiver. Years blurred together in a cycle of routine and quiet exhaustion. I wasn't looking for gratitude. I just wanted to honor my parents. When Dad passed, I was heartbroken, but also relieved that his suffering had ended. That's when James suddenly became present. Flying in every other week, going through paperwork with Mom, making adjustments to accounts. He told me not to worry, that he was just making sure everything was in order. I noticed Mom becoming distant, questioning me about small expenses. It stung, but I told myself it was grief clouding her mind. 6 months later, she passed in her sleep. Losing both parents in such a short time left me numb. I wasn't thinking about money or inheritance. I was mourning. So when James invited me to the lawyer's office for the will reading, I walked in expecting fairness, recognition for the years I'd sacrificed, for the home I thought would always be mine. But instead, I was handed a brutal reality. $50,000 and a few sentimental items. That was it. James, on the other hand, inherited everything else. The family home, the investment portfolios, Dad's art collection assets worth millions. When I looked at him searching for answers, he shrugged and said Mom was worried about your financial decisions. She wanted me to manage things properly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything I had done, after giving up my life for this family, I was being cast aside like I didn't matter. At 63, I found myself without a home, without security, and without the brother I thought I knew. But what I didn't realize then was that my father had left me more than memories. He had left me a secret one that would change everything. I wish I could say I stood up to James right then and there, that I stormed out of that lawyer's office with a plan. But the truth is, I was paralyzed. I walked back into the house I had called home for over 40 years, only to realize it no longer belonged to me. James had already started making arrangements to sell it. His real estate agent showed up the next day, measuring rooms and discussing market value, like I was invisible. I packed my things in silence, each box feeling heavier than the last. Not because of the weight, but because every item I touched carried a lifetime of memories I was being forced to abandon. James didn't even offer to help. He simply told me, "The sooner you're out, the sooner we can finalize the sale." I wanted to scream. To remind him who kept this family together while he chased his career, but what was the point? Legally, he held all the cards. With no savings and nowhere to go, I found a tiny apartment across town. It was nothing more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was all I could afford. I spent my days surrounded by moving boxes, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Nights were worse. That's when the doubts crept in. Had I been foolish to trust James? Was I naive to think loyalty meant anything when money was involved? Weeks passed, and every time I drove by the old house, I saw more signs of change. For sale banners, open house notices, strangers walking through rooms where my family once gathered for holidays. One afternoon, I returned to pick up a few remaining belongings James had carelessly dumped in the garage. That's when I noticed Dad's old desk pushed into a corner, dusty and forgotten. It wasn't just any desk, it was where Dad spent hours writing letters, balancing accounts, and keeping his most important papers. I couldn't leave it behind. Something told me to look closer. As I ran my fingers along the edges, I felt a slight ridge underneath one of the drawers. A hidden latch, I pressed it, and a small compartment popped open, one I never knew existed. Inside was a single envelope yellowed with age, but carefully sealed. My name was written on the front in Dad's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was dated a week before his Alzheimer's diagnosis. His words were clear, deliberate, like he knew this would be his last chance to speak to me without the fog of illness. "Katherine, if you're reading this, then things have unfolded as I feared. I need you to know that I've always seen your sacrifices, even if others have overlooked them." I could barely breathe as I read on. Dad explained that years ago he had created a separate trust, one that no one else knew about. He had transferred ownership of the family home to my name and secured offshore investments worth $12 million. He wrote, "Your mother and James were never aware of these arrangements. I did this to protect you, knowing that James might manipulate the situation after I was gone." Tears streamed down my face. All those years I thought I was alone in my sacrifices. Dad had been thinking of me all along. Enclosed with the letter were detailed instructions, account numbers, and legal documents proving everything he said. It was overwhelming. For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel relief, anger, or sadness. But one thing was certain. James didn't own that house, and he definitely wasn't entitled to the fortune my father had quietly preserved for me. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something. I thought I had lost hope, but I knew better than to rush in. Blindly, James was a seasoned lawyer, and if I wanted justice, I needed to play this smart. It was time to turn the tables. I sat at my tiny kitchen table, staring at the letter and documents spread out before me. The weight of what I held in my hands was almost too much to process. $12 million. The family home already in my name. Proof that my father had never intended for James to control anything. But this wasn't just about money. It was about betrayal. About the years I spent believing my brother would honor what was fair, only to find out he had twisted our mother's trust and pushed me aside without hesitation. I knew there was no turning back. Once I confronted James, the fragile thread connecting us as family would snap for good. But I wasn't going to let fear keep me silent. Still, I wasn't naive. James had built a career out of winning legal battles. If I made one wrong move, he'd find a way to bury this. I needed someone who could match his expertise. The next morning, I contacted an old friend of my father's, Mr. Caldwell, a retired attorney who once handled some of Dad's business dealings. He was in his late 70s now, but sharp as ever. When I showed him the letter and documents, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Your father was a smart man, Katherine." This paperwork is airtight. James won't have a leg to stand on. Hearing those words felt like a lifeline. For the first time, I believed justice was possible. Mr. Caldwell agreed to come out of retirement for one last case pro bono, not because he had to, but because he respected my father and despised opportunists like James. We spent days reviewing every detail, ensuring that every document was in order before making our move. But with each passing hour, the weight of what was coming pressed heavier on me. I wasn't just confronting my brother. I was about to expose him for manipulating a grieving, vulnerable mother. Once this was done, there would be no reconciliation, no family dinners, no holiday cards. Whatever bond we once had would be gone forever. The final straw came when I received a call from James's real estate agent. She informed me that the house had been listed and there was already a serious buyer. James was moving fast, eager to cash in before I could even catch my breath. That was it. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Mr. Caldwell drafted a formal notice asserting my legal ownership of the property, along with documentation of the trust and offshore accounts. It was time to deliver it personally. I drove to the house, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than I realized. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw James standing on the front porch, phone pressed to his ear, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. He glanced at me and smirked. "Did you forget something, Katie? The movers already cleared out your stuff." I felt a surge of anger but kept my voice steady. "We need to talk. Now." He rolled his eyes but followed me inside. The house felt hollow, stripped of warmth, just like our relationship. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and slid it toward him. "What's this?" he asked, clearly annoyed. "Go ahead. Read it." As his eyes scanned the documents, the color drained from his face. He read the letter twice, then flipped through the legal papers in disbelief. This is a joke, right?" he stammered. "There's no way Dad did this without telling anyone." "He did," I replied calmly, "and now you know why." James tried to regain his composure, slipping into his lawyer persona. "These documents won't hold up. Mom's will is the only valid directive." I shook my head. Dad's trust predates any changes Mom made. The house was never hers to give, and neither were those assets. When I handed him Mr. Caldwell's business card, his confidence finally cracked. He knew the name, knew exactly how serious this was. For a moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. That's when I realized James wasn't invincible, and I wasn't powerless. There was no going back now. The game had changed, and for once, I was the one holding all the cards. James stood there gripping the papers like they might dissolve if he held them too tightly. For once, he had nothing clever to say, no smug remarks, no legal jargon to twist the truth. But I knew better than to think he'd surrender without a fight. James wasn't just my brother anymore, he was my opponent. And opponents like him didn't back down easily. I left him in that kitchen speechless and drove straight to Mr. Caldwell's office. It was time to execute the plan we had carefully crafted. First, we filed the necessary documents with the county to officially reaffirm my ownership of the house. Even though the deed had been transferred years ago, it was crucial to update records and block any potential sale attempts. "Next, Mr. Caldwell sent a cease and desist letter to James's real estate agent informing her that any transaction involving the property would be considered fraudulent. By the end of the day, the house was pulled off the market. I could only imagine James's reaction when he got that call. But this was just the beginning. The offshore accounts were next. Following my father's detailed instructions, we contacted the financial institutions handling the trust. It wasn't simple. Layers of security, identity verification, and legal protocols stood in the way, but Dad had prepared for everything. With the right codes, signatures, and documentation, access was granted. Within a week, $12 million were sitting safely under my control. It felt surreal. For so long, I had been scraping by, counting every dollar, wondering how I'd survive. Now I had more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But I wasn't interested in revenge through wealth. This wasn't about flaunting money or humiliating James. It was about restoring what was rightfully mine and honoring my father's wishes. James, of course, didn't stay quiet for long. He called me 3 days later, his voice laced with forced calm. "Katherine, we need to be reasonable about this," he began. "I'm sure we can come to some kind of agreement without dragging this through court." I almost laughed at the irony. After what he did, he wanted to negotiate. "I don't think so, James," I replied firmly. "You made your choices. Now you'll have to live with them." He tried to gaslight me, claiming I misunderstood Mom's intentions, that she was only trying to protect me. But his words held no power anymore. I had the truth and the law on my side. Mr. Caldwell advised me to document every interaction just in case James attempted any legal maneuvers. And sure enough, a week later, I received notice that James was contesting the trust, claiming Dad wasn't of sound mind when he signed the documents. It was a desperate move, one that Mr. Caldwell anticipated. We quickly produced medical records showing that the trust and property transfer occurred before Dad's diagnosis. Everything had been notarized, witnessed, and filed correctly. James had no case. The court dismissed his claim within days. With every failed attempt, James grew quieter. His emails stopped. His calls ended. And just like that, the brother who once controlled everything vanished from my life. I stood in the doorway of my family home, my home feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in years, but I didn't see dollar signs or property value. I saw memories. I saw the legacy my father had fought to protect, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do next. This money wasn't just for me to live out my days in comfort, it was a gift, one born from sacrifice, foresight, and love. So I met with Mr. Caldwell one last time and told him my decision. I was going to establish a foundation in my father's name, one dedicated to supporting caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. People like me who gave up everything to care for loved ones. People who often ended up forgotten, exhausted, and alone. Mr. Caldwell smiled. "Your father would be proud, Katherine." For the first time in a long while, I felt proud too, not because I had won against James, but because I had turned a story of betrayal into something meaningful. I wasn't just reclaiming my inheritance, I was reclaiming my purpose. A month later, I stood in front of the house, my house watching, as the final "for sale" sign was taken down for good. It felt like more than just reclaiming a building. It was reclaiming my history and my dignity. But I knew there was still one last conversation that needed to happen. Closure not for James, but for me. I invited him to meet me at a quiet cafe downtown. He showed up late as usual, dressed in his expensive suit, but the confidence he once wore like armor was noticeably cracked. We sat in silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "So, is this where you gloat?" I shook my head. "No, James, I didn't ask you here for revenge. I just want you to understand something." He leaned back, crossing his arms, clearly defensive. I could see the bitterness in his eyes, the same bitterness that drove him to betray his own sister. "I trusted you." I began, my voice steady. "For years I believed we were on the same side, that family mattered more than money or power." James scoffed. "Yeah, well, trusting people doesn't get you very far in the real world, Katherine." I sighed, realizing there was no reaching the brother I once knew. Maybe he'd been gone long before our parents passed. Maybe ambition had consumed whatever decency he had left. "I didn't come here to argue," I said quietly. "I came here to tell you that this is the last time we'll speak." That caught him off guard. He expected a fight, expected me to drag this out like a courtroom drama. But I was done. "I have no interest in punishing you. James' life will handle that on its own." He shifted uncomfortably, searching for words, but found none. For the first time, silence was my victory. As I stood to leave, I placed a brochure on the table. It was for the foundation I'd just launched, bearing Dad's name in bold letters. "If you ever wonder what I did with everything you tried to steal, here's your answer." I walked away without looking back. In the weeks that followed, I poured my energy into building the foundation. The story of how it began spread quickly. Local news outlets picked it up, calling it a tale of resilience and justice. But I didn't care about the headlines. What mattered were the people who showed up, caregivers who had been silently fighting battles. Like I once did, I listened to their stories, offered support, and provided resources, funded by the wealth my father had entrusted to me. Every time I handed out a grant or organized a support group, I felt a piece of myself heal. As for James, word got around that his reputation took a hit. Clients became wary of a lawyer who manipulated his own family. He didn't face legal consequences, but sometimes losing credibility is a harsher sentence than jail time. He moved back to New York and I never heard from him again. And honestly, I was fine with that. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch of my restored family home, I thought about my parents. I wondered if Mom ever truly knew what James had done, or if she had been too blinded by trust just like I was. But I didn't hold on to that bitterness anymore. I realized that carrying anger only weighed me down. Instead, I chose to remember the love that built this family before greed tore it apart. I chose to honor my father's faith in me, not by hoarding wealth, but by making sure it served a purpose greater than myself. The house was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe knowing I hadn't just survived betrayal. I had risen above it. Looking back, I understood something vital. James may have won a battle when he manipulated our mother's will, but in the end he lost something far more valuable than money. He lost his family, he lost his integrity, and he lost the chance to do the right thing when it mattered most. As for me, I gained more than I ever thought possible, not just financial security, but clarity, strength, and a renewed sense of purpose, and that I realized was the true inheritance my father wanted me to have all along. It's been 2 years since I found that letter, 2 years since I learned the truth about my father's quiet wisdom and my brother's betrayal. Today, my life looks nothing like the one I thought I'd be living at 63. I'm not struggling in a small apartment wondering how to make ends meet. I'm standing on solid ground both financially and emotionally. The foundation I built has grown beyond anything I imagined. We've helped hundreds of caregivers, people who, like me, put their lives on hold for the sake of family. Every time I see their gratitude, I think of my father. He knew what it meant to protect those who give without expecting anything in return. As for James, I don't waste time thinking about him anymore. Some losses are blessings in disguise. Family isn't defined by blood alone. It's defined by loyalty, respect, and the choices we make when no one's watching. I've learned that trusting others is important, but trusting yourself is essential. If I had ignored that instinct to check Dad's desk, if I had accepted James's version of the truth, I would have lost everything, not just my inheritance, but my sense of worth. Looking back, I understand now that silence can be dangerous. When you don't stand up for yourself, people like James will write your story for you, and they'll make sure you come out with nothing. But the greatest lesson I've carried from all this is simple. Real wealth isn't measured by what you have, it's measured by how you use it. My father left me more than money. He left me a chance to turn pain into purpose, and I intend to honor that every single day. If you ever find yourself betrayed by those closest to you, remember, it's not the betrayal that defines you, it's how you rise after it, because sometimes the most powerful revenge is living a life they never expected you to have.